Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore, and this here is the Anbernic RG35XX Plus. And this just arrived in the mail a few minutes ago, and so we're going to do a quick impressions video right now. Now generally I like to do a full review when one of these devices arrives, however there's a bit of a story here in that the Anbernic review units were all delayed in Hong Kong, and so as a result this device is already up for sale right now, but all of the reviewers are just getting their devices today. And so what we're going to do is a quick impressions video right here and now with the device that I have in hand, and I think later down the line, once we have more time for testing and trying out different software, we can do a full review then. So I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible, and my goal is to make this video under 20 minutes. We'll see how we do. To start, here's a look at the box, and as you can see there are three different color options: gray, transparent, black, and white. And like I mentioned, the device is already up for sale right now, and you can see the starting price is about 58 bucks, but this is only during the initial first few days while it's in pre-sale. After that it's going to go up to $64, and that also does not include shipping. So in the end, we're looking at a device that costs about $70 to $80 altogether, depending on where you live and how much shipping is going to cost. Now, I don't want to dive too far into the specs, but I do want to give you a quick overview of this device. And this is an upgraded version of the original Anbernic RG35XX, which came out late last year. Now the big changes here are going to be an upgraded chipset. This is running an H700 with a 1.5 GHz clock speed. In addition, it has a gigabyte of LPDDR4 RAM, and every device is going to come with a 64 GB SD card, but you can also buy a larger card with more games on it if you'd like. Other upgrades include Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 4.2, and the battery is also a little bit larger at 3300 mAh. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look inside of the box and see what we have to work with. And first and foremost, underneath the device you will find a screen protector, and then also a quick start guide which will walk you through the stock operating system. And it also comes with a USB-A to USB-C charging cable. Of note, I did try a USB-C to USB-C cable and it did not charge, so you will have to use something that has USB-A on one end and then USB-C on the other. And while it's charging, you will see a red indicator light up here on top. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's go ahead and look at the RG35XX Plus. So first impressions here, it is exactly the same size as the original 35XX, but one of the things I first noticed is that it has a different texture to it. It actually has a more matte feel to the plastic, and so it's a little bit grippier and grittier, and I kind of like that. Now on the front you can see that we have glossy buttons just like the previous version, but these are now labeled with A, B, and XY in a rainbow color pattern. Other than that, the front does look pretty similar to the previous model. Now a lot of the changes are actually on the back. Number one, you can see that there's a battery compartment right here, and the shoulders have also gotten a redesign. They now have a sloped angle to them vertically. And this is very similar to a line of buttons on Etsy called the Better buttons, and so I think they might have borrowed that design. Either way, I do like the slope of the buttons here, and it does make it more comfortable for your index fingers to rest on. So I do think that is a welcome change. And finally, the last big hardware change externally is the D-pad. If you ever tried the original 35XX or watched any video about it, you know that this one had issues with accidental diagonals. And so we'll test that in a minute, but I did want to say that my initial impressions here that it is a little bit softer to the touch. In fact, it almost kind of feels like a halfway point between a Miyoo Mini Plus and the original RG35XX. So I would say among all of the D-pads that I've tested from Anbernic, this one might be the softest, and I really like the feel of it. It still has a good amount of pivot to it as well. So of course, let's go ahead and test it, starting with the contra test. Here I'm going to press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right and see how much the character moves. And as you can see, the character just barely moves every once in a while. And this is actually kind of the perfect place to be in with this game in particular. This means that when you want to press a diagonal, you will, but if you don't and you want to duck down without moving your character, it's probably going to be pretty easy to do so. And so this is kind of an ideal situation when it comes to playing Contra or other similar platforming games. Another standard test I like to do right off the bat is a Street Fighter game to see how it's going to work when it comes to Shoryukens and Hadoukens. And I can tell immediately that it's pretty easy to press these diagonals, although it is taking me a little bit of time to get used to this different feel when it comes to the D-pad pivot, as well as that softer membrane. All the same, even in this first round of playing, the longer I played, even after a few seconds, I did start to feel it a little bit better. And so I would call this D-pad Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable with a little bit of practice. And overall, yes, this is a big improvement on the D-pad, and I think it's a lot better than it was before. Now the face buttons are exactly the same, nice rubber membrane connection and feel really nice and retro. So really no complaints here when it comes to the controls, it all feels pretty good. The start, select, and menu buttons all have a rubber membrane connection as well and feel nice and retro too. Now in terms of the rest of the externals, everything's the same. So on the left side we have our volume up and down, and then on the right side we have our power and reset buttons, and then down below we have 2 different SD card slots. And like I mentioned, this one will already come preloaded with a 64GB card, and it'll also have a bunch of installed games on here as well. In fact, all my testing are going to be done with the games on this card. On the bottom we just have a single USB-C charging port and then a 3.5mm headphone jack. And then finally up top, we have a mini HDMI port. So this means you will be able to plug this into a TV or a monitor, and you'll be able to play games on a big screen, just like you could with the original 35XX. Next, let's take a look inside of the battery compartment. This will require a Phillips head screwdriver, and inside you can see we have a typical Anbernic battery. And sure enough, yes, this is rated for 3300 milliamp hours, and it has a 12.21 watt-hour capacity. So this is going to be pretty easy if you need to replace the battery without having to take the entire device apart. And I do like the fact that the compartment can be screwed in, which is going to make it really tightly fit with the rest of the case. In fact, when you have it screwed together, you can't even tell with your fingers that there's a compartment here in the back. It just feels really super solid, so that's awesome. Let's do a couple quick size comparisons. We'll start with the original 35XX. And the face here is a little bit different. You can see the start and select buttons are lower down on the device, and the menu button's a little bit higher as well. You can also see that the bezels on the front are black on the 35XX Plus, whereas the original one, depending on the model, would have different color bezels. Other than that, everything seems to be almost exactly the same. In fact, it looks like they're using the same design shells as the previous model. So if you like the size of the old one, this is definitely going to fit at home right here. And really the only difference cosmetically on the outside are going to be the shoulder buttons and then that compartment for the battery. Now in terms of size, you might not know what the 35XX is going to be like, so let's do a couple other comparisons. We'll start with the Mio Mini Plus, which is probably its biggest competitor because they're about the same price, but as I'll show you here later, the 35XX Plus is now a lot more performant. And you can also see that the Mio Mini Plus is a little bit smaller as well. Now if you've never tried that device, let's try a couple others. We'll start with the original Game Boy, and then next we have the Game Boy Color, so I hope that gives you a good perspective. At the end of the day, when it comes to hardware, I think that everything's been pretty much improved. The original was a really great device already, but I do like the additions of these improved shoulder buttons, and it does feel like the D-pad is a lot better as well. So let's go ahead and start up the device and take a look at the stock firmware that we have to work with. And sure enough, the design here looks exactly like the stock firmware on the original 35XX. Now, I wasn't a huge fan of this firmware compared to the custom options that we got later on, and I do think we'll probably see a lot of custom firmware options for this here soon. All the same, let's look at what we have to work with at least initially. Now the settings menu is very similar to how it was on the original device, but there are a couple new options. For example, we have Bluetooth settings. And within here, we can turn on Bluetooth and then also scan for new devices. And sure enough, yeah, I was able to find my 8BitDo SN30 Pro on the first try. And after connecting it, yeah, it worked fine within the menu. I could navigate through everything just fine. However, I did find that when starting up a game in RetroArch, it did not recognize the controller inputs. And if I went into RetroArch and changed player 1 to be the 8BitDo SN30 Pro, it actually made it so the Bluetooth controller would not work, as well as the onboard buttons wouldn't work on the device either. So it does look like there is going to be some software configuration that needs to be updated or fixed in order to really work with Bluetooth, at least right now. And so I think that's probably going to be a challenge for the custom firmware developers as they start to work on this device. Now, in addition, within the settings menu, we now have some Wi-Fi options. And this was very simple to set up. I just turned it on, scanned for my network, and then connected. And so you'll be able to do things like online multiplayer as well as retro achievements. In addition, within the settings, there's Moonlight options, and so you'll be able to do game streaming on this device if you'd like to do that as well. And other than that, these settings here seems to be pretty standard. You can do things like change out the layout, but otherwise there's not a lot of other things that you can do here. Now let's go ahead and get oriented with the software experience and how it is when you're actually playing a game. To start, we have two options. One is called Game Rooms, and the other one is called RetroArch Game. And for the most part, I would recommend using the RetroArch one. As you can see here, it's going to show you an icon for the different systems that are supported. And I'll go ahead and scroll through this so you can see all of the different systems that are available on that initial SD card. And you can see that most of these standard options are there, but of note, there is no Nintendo 64 option. And I'm not sure what's going on here, if they even have an emulator set up, or maybe they just didn't put any games in here because there is no analog stick, and so it may not be a great fit. Either way, that's definitely another thing that we'll have to focus on in the final review. Now, the other option is the Game Room section. And within here, it's going to be a bunch of standalone emulators. And truth be told, a lot of these are not going to be very good, but I would say among them, probably the PSP one is going to be your best bet. In general, the standalone version of that emulator usually works better than within RetroArch. Now, if we go in here and start up a game, you can see that it'll start right up. But if we press the menu button to get into the options, you can see that we're severely limited when it comes to our options. And so while this might work okay for a pick up and play experience, I think that you're just going to be better suited going into the RetroArch section instead. And this is going to play all the same games as you saw on the standalone emulators. It's basically pulling from the same folders. But the nice thing about RetroArch is that you'll have a bunch of different options, including turning on retro achievements and multiplayer. But then also you can mess around with things like shaders and filters to change the picture as well. And of course, in addition, you can change things like aspect ratio and turn on frames per second and hotkeys, all that good stuff. Another example would be when starting up a Game Boy game, you can just press the menu button to get into the quick menu, and then here within the RetroArch options, you can turn on colorization, and that'll give you a more green look so it looks like an original Game Boy game. Now, I did a little bit of testing here in this initial video, but like I mentioned in the intro, I'm going to save a lot of that for the final review. After all, I think custom firmware will probably even make this a better experience. But for now, I do want to test out some of these stock options, and I really want to focus on the high-end emulators that weren't available on the original RG35XX. So let's go ahead and jump directly into Dreamcast, starting with Soul Calibur. And I was surprised to see here that it actually played at full speed. We got about 59-60 frames per second the entire time. The other nice thing about playing Dreamcast in RetroArch is that it has an auto frame skip enabled, and it actually works pretty well. For example, with this game, Marvel vs. Capcom, it actually doesn't run at a full 60 frames per second, but as long as it stays above 30, it's going to be a pretty smooth experience. It's definitely not going to be a perfect recreation of the Dreamcast, but still for around $60-$70, it's pretty incredible that we have such a tiny device that can play Dreamcast in the first place. And so at least in my initial testing, trying out the games that were preloaded on the card, I did find that quite a few games here played really well. Crazy Taxi 2, Virtua Tennis. I would actually consider all these games to be playable. They're not perfect, but still it's worth actually testing out. Now, PSP was a little bit more involved. For example, the settings were all hosed up, so I had to go in here and make some changes. Number one, I had to adjust the aspect ratio to 16:9, and they also had frame skip turned on by default, so I turned that off so we can get a better gauge of the actual performance. And so as you can see here, playing Ridge Racer, which is a pretty hard game to play on PSP, there are many moments when it's actually playing at full speed. It will definitely lag when it comes to certain areas within this racetrack, but at least in initial impressions of gauging the power of this chipset, I would say it's better than the RK3326, and maybe just a little bit worse than the RK3566. And considering the fact that the devices that usually will use those chipsets are quite a bit more expensive than this one, I think we're actually in a pretty good place when it comes to price to performance. And of course, bear in mind that this is a much smaller device, and so it's pretty cool that we have something so small that is still quite powerful. Now, when it comes to PSP, when you play a lightweight 2D game like Metal Slug XX, it actually plays at full speed. And so there will be other games, puzzle games, role-playing games that'll probably be definitely playable. However, I did find some of the harder to play games like Tekken 6, unfortunately this doesn't play at full speed. So you're going to have to either play with a frame skip on or just maybe try other games that are going to work better. And so in wrapping up here with my initial impressions of the RG35XX Plus, I do think this is a pretty big improvement overall from the predecessor. And I love the fact that it's not that much more expensive. It's about $10 more, but you're going to get a lot better performance and improved D-pad and shoulder buttons, and then also Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Now, it's a little bit ironic that this device doesn't have an analog stick, considering the fact that many analog stick style systems will now play on it, but all the same, I think you can find some pretty good D-pad centric games from those systems to play on this. So in the end, here's the way I see it. Yes, it's a big improvement over the predecessor, but if you already have the original 35XX, I'm not really sure it's going to be worth spending all this money just to get those improvements. However, if you're just now shopping around for a mini device around the $70 price point, I do think this one's probably going to be your best bang for your buck within this price point. Now, I still have a lot more to test. For example, I want to try custom firmware options as they become available, and I also think we're going to have to do a deep dive comparison between this one and the Miyoo Mini Plus. Either way, I do think the Anbernic RG35XX Plus is off to a great start, and I think it's only going to get better from here once the community gets it and they start making even better improvements on the software side. Anyway, let me know what you think about these initial impressions of this device, and let me know what other things you want me to test in future content with this handheld. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.